Dr. Wallis spent 33 years as a Christian minister and reached high positions as a church doctor and an archdeacon. And he found evidence in the Hebrew Bible of extraterrestrial contact. And he's been showing through a series of books called the Eden series how this extraterrestrial contact has been covered up in the Christian and the Jewish traditions, and he's now exposing it for the world.
Você está ouvindo Exopolítica, hoje com Dr. Michael Salla, sua fonte para a verdade, sem censura, sobre a agenda política e global extraterrestre humana. Clique no botão curtir e inscreva-se neste canal. Com vocês agora está o Dr. Michael Salla.
Well, welcome, Paul, to Exopolitics Today.
Good day, Michael. It's great to be with you again.
Yes, g'day indeed. You're living in or visiting Queensland, Australia, which I spent 5 years there. That's where I did my PhD at the University of Queensland, a wonderful state. I definitely enjoy visiting there again during my holidays in Australia.
Oh, good choice. It is where I live now, a little bit warmer than where I was before.
Okay, Canberra. All right. Well, yeah, I stayed in Canberra too. It is a little bit colder there. So, Paul, you've recently released the 4th installment in your Eden series, the Eden Conspiracy. So, why don't you tell my listeners what it was that inspired you to produce a 4th book in that series?
For sure. Well, the first book in the series, Escaping from Eden, follows my journey as I begin to work out there's something else going on in the Bible, which I'd been growingly aware of through my 33 years in church-based ministry. One of my jobs was as a theological educator. So not only was I preaching from the Bible, I was teaching pastors how to interpret the Bible, how to handle ancient texts to get out of them what the writers put in. And through that journey, I could see there was something funny going on in the stories that we weren't quite getting to with our conventional preachings. So you follow the journey in Escaping from Eden as I realized that there are these words that get translated as God that really shouldn't have been translated that way. They mean something else. By the end of Escaping from Eden, I've shown that there are ETs referenced in the biblical narratives, particularly in the Hebrew canon, what we call the Old Testament. So by the time I got to the 4th in the series, the Eden Conspiracy, I realized I had to circle back and look at that again, because is it just that the Bible is the book we thought it was, but there are a few aliens in it? Or is it actually about something completely different? If many of the stories we thought were God's stories are really stories of something else, is the Bible really the story of something else? And so I go back, I go into the root meanings of keywords from cover to cover, and I follow that white rabbit deeper and realize that the Bible offers us a rich education in many, many things, in ancient ET contact, in lessons to do with colonization, covert government, hidden hands in our economics and politics. A layered education is offered to us once we start reading it through the lens of paleo contact. And as I made that journey, I realized that the Bible itself tells us the story of how the narrative of paleo contact was taken, suppressed, changed, and replaced with monotheism. The Bible shows us when this happened, even gives us the names of the people who did it. And that's what comes to light in the Eden Conspiracy.
Well, it's a very appropriate book and topic, because now, as many are aware, the extraterrestrial topic is going mainstream. I mean, now with these different UAP or UFO study groups, more and more people are now inquiring about the possibility of extraterrestrial life. But here you've found that there is historical evidence showing that this extraterrestrial visitation is not a new thing at all. It goes way back thousands and thousands of years, which is remarkable.
Exactly. And you're right, there's been a great acceleration in terms of open disclosure of contact phenomena from 2017 on, when there was that semi-official leak of the Nimitz footage of the Tic Tac craft. Then in 2019, the Pentagon comes forward and authenticates that footage and comes clean and says, yes, we've had a department in place for 70 plus years investigating UFO crashes and examining physical artifacts from crash retrievals. So all of a sudden, the conversation goes mainstream. David Grush in the last few weeks has taken it to the next degree and said, yes, it's not only bits and pieces of craft, we've got entire craft, some of them functional, and pilots. So anyone following the news is suddenly being shown contact and contact at a covert government level. Now, people who follow the topic might not be surprised as this picture opens up, but also anyone who reads the Bible deeply or who listens to the indigenous and ancestral narratives of people groups all around the world, they'll realize that these claims are only telling us what our ancestors told us. The Bible tells us that there was covert contact. The Mayan tradition tells us that ancient rulers had contact while the mainstream society did not. So it's an old picture that's simply being reasserted.
Indeed. And one of the things that looking at this kind of recent exposure that people like David Grush have given to the whole UFO ET topic is that many mainstream people are speculating about this in terms of some of these craft being crashed recently and being studied in corporations and being reverse engineered. But I think there's also a lot of evidence that some of these craft that have been found are not recent things at all, that some of them go back thousands of years, that they could even be related to some of the vehicles described in the Bible. I mean, there's many descriptions of, of Ezekiel's wheel. You have Noah's Ark. So could some of these vehicles be currently in the possession or being studied by some of these corporations?
Yes, on the basis of my studies, I would say absolutely, because the Bible does make reference to ancient technology. So we have craft that are described. We have the word kavod, conventionally translated as glory, and the word ruach, conventionally translated as spirit. But you look at how those words operate in the texts, and you'll realize that a kavod can be in the sky or on the ground, can be to the left or to the right, can be moving across the landscape, that it can launch and land vertically, SpaceX style, and that it will shake the ground as it lands and launches, and that you can't be out in the open when it launches and lands. So you've got this kind of technology that's portrayed from the outside. Moses describes it from the outside, the cloudy pillar, as it's called. And then you've got Ezekiel telling us what it looks like from the inside, the metal textures, the transparent canopy, the sound of the engines when they fire up, the vibrating feeling when the engines start, how the rotors respond to voice commands, wheels described in such detail that NASA has a patent on them. So no, it's not the Spirit of God, it's a craft. It's sometimes called the ruach because it creates a blast of air. And that's what the word ruach means. So you've got technology like that referenced. You also have wormhole and portal phenomena referenced in biblical texts, and also, as I show in the Eden Conspiracy, referenced in archaeological finds. And so when I published my first book of Paleo Contact, Escaping from Eden, I started to be contacted by veterans of war, and in particular, veterans of the war in Iraq, the 2003 incursion into Iraq. And the questions they came to me were often, what's the credibility of portal technology, Stargate technology? And they were asking me because they had gone into that war thinking they were there for one set of reasons, the public reasons, for regime change, to rescue the world from weapons of mass destruction. And then they get there and they find their particular unit is on an archaeological mission. And then when they get back, they start sounding out their comrades, and they found that some of them were on missions that were to do with ancient technology, Stargate technology. And so they asked me, what's the credibility of that? Do you have any privileged information? And my answer has been, I don't have privileged information. I haven't had eyes on. Some of your colleagues may have, because if I follow the texts of the Bible, if I read them in parallel with the source narratives from ancient Sumeria, they say that if you're looking for Stargate technology, you will look in the country that today we call Iraq. They report that it was operative thousands of years ago. Now, if any world power supposed for one moment that there was ancient and maybe possibly functional Stargate technology on the planet, they would want to have it. They wouldn't want anyone else getting it. And so you will go into the country and you will create a World Heritage Order around that place. You will give it a military guard. You'll stop anyone else excavating there. And that really is the story of the recent past, as our forces, have looked for ancient technology. And so my very strong suspicion is not only have we looked, but we have found. And once found, of course, you would want to know, how does this work? Can we use these? Can we reverse engineer these? If you've been examining it for 70 years, of course, you'll be addressing those questions.
I think that the Iraq invasion in 2003 and the events leading up to it are very significant for this topic. And I remember at the time there was a team of German archaeologists that had just found the tomb of Gilgamesh. Yes. And that, of course, is one of the oldest epic poems that's known to exist. And I think that clearly they found things there that the US government, in addition to whatever cuneiform texts that had been retrieved from Iraq earlier, whatever was found in the tomb of Gilgamesh, I think did play an important role in the eventual decision to invade Iraq, because, yes, as you said, the justification was entirely concocted. So they wanted to get in there, and they just came up with a spurious
pretext. And it was clearly very, very far forward in the mix of reasons to go in, because within days of establishing the Allied presence in Iraq, within days, the archaeological team was there excavating the Gilgamesh site. And I remember Jörg Fassbinder briefing the BBC about this exciting mission, that through soil magnetization, they'd identified a site that correlated with all the details given in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And the amazing thing about that is twofold. First of all, the Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest written narrative in the world that is known. And it tells the story of Gilgamesh, a crossover king between the ET kings, the sky people or Anunnaki, who governed our ancestors in the deep past, and then the human lineages of kings and queens and rulers who came after. Gilgamesh was a crossover, and he was a hybrid. So the opportunity of this find was to fact test the world's most ancient story. Was it fiction? Was this story that talked about ET rulers and then human leaders following fiction, or did it happen? And the find in Iraq meant we could test that. We could establish if there were ETs governing us in the deep past. It was the find of the age. And yet we get there and it all goes silent. A few years later, Jörg Fassbinder is speaking to a French journal, and his explanation is, we decided not to explore any further. We decided to bury the site for its protection. Well, is that logical? That it was so important that within days of going into Iraq, we're there to dig it up and then we change our minds? Isn't it more likely that we didn't want to do the tests in public? We wanted to know what the result was before deciding what to do next. And I would suggest that if the result had been, oh, there's nothing to see here, it's just very old human remains, they would have published that. It's only if they'd found something further reaching that it would go quiet. So follow the story. You can Google it for yourself and follow the logic. Something was found, and it must have verified the ancient stories. Otherwise, we would have been told.
Well, I think if you go to the Sumerian records and the descriptions of Gilgamesh, as you said, as a hybrid, as a demigod, and the Anunnaki were giants, it stands to reason that Gilgamesh was a giant himself, giant of stature, physical stature. And so if they find this tomb with the remains of Gilgamesh in there, this remains of a giant right there, there's a big problem in terms of revealing this to the world. And the second is, and this maybe gets into an area that is speculation still, but maybe you know something about this. There's a lot of rumors, and several of my sources have said that there are these stasis chambers. What we consider a tomb may be a stasis chamber, perfectly preserving the body of these giants from ancient times who have lain dormant and are now in the process of waking up. So do you want to speak to that?
I can only speculate about that because I don't have any privileged information there, but those are the kinds of questions, I'll put it that way, that are asked by people who were there, who had boots in the field, who were part of the operations, and who just through putting fragments of the story together from what they saw, from what their comrades saw, they're realizing something along those lines is afoot.
Well, I've been working with an army insider who I've known for 15 years now, and he's active army, and he's sharing some information, and he's physically has seen a tomb or a stasis chamber with like a 12-foot giant in there, perfectly preserved, asleep, and that this is part of the kind of like the Americas tradition of Quetzalcoatl of returning, and
Yes.
I think you find that elsewhere. So yeah,
Definitely. And it's what we would expect to find once we've read the King's List and the timeline on which these ancient beings were able to operate and live.
Well, if we go to one of the earliest Sumerian texts, which the earliest historical text that's known to exist, which is the Enuma Elish. It talks about Kingu, who is a kind of an ancestor of the Anunnaki, and it was from his blood that humanity was genetically engineered. So you want to tell us about the importance of Kingu in terms of the Anunnaki creating or genetically creating humanity?
Certainly. What I find fascinating is that the same basic story occurs in ancient ancestral narratives all around the world, whether you're listening to the biblical, the Sumerian, the Mayan, African, Greek, Norse. There are these moments of hybridization in order to create Homo sapiens as we know ourselves to be. And there's always some metaphor by which we're told that we're looking at the DNA of the visitors being spliced with the DNA of our primate ancestors to create Homo sapiens. The little gloss on that story in the Sumerian is fascinating because it's not just any old visitor's DNA that's spliced with the human DNA. They pick this character Kingu or Kingu, and they decide he is the perfect candidate because he is one of the Anunnaki, he's one of the sky people, and that's the kind of DNA they want to introduce into the primate. But they're looking for a Homo sapiens that is easily managed, that's easily overpowered. And the point of the Kingu story is he is an Anunnaki, he is a sky person, but he's been defeated by the powers who are running Project Earth and running this region of space. So the idea of a higher being, but he's been defeated, bingo, that'll get us the kind of human we want, because all they want is a human race that is clever enough to work for them and do what they want, but not so clever that we don't want to work for them. And that same balancing act is described in the Sumerian stories and in the Mayan stories as they fine-tune. And one of the correlations that first got my attention and that made me think, perhaps these stories around the world aren't coincidentally similar. Maybe they're actually curating ancient memory. One of the correlations was the fact that we've got stories of upgrade, 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 now an upgrade through gene splicing, and now a downgrade through something in the environment to fine-tune our cognitive abilities to the point where we are limited to what's right in front of us through our 5 physical senses. And for any other information, we're dependent on an authority telling us. All the stories talk about getting us to that point, and once we're there, we can be managed. And so the blood of Kingu is the Sumerian version of that story.
What we get in the Sumerian text is this rivalry, this competition between Enlil, the space commander in charge of the Anunnaki space fleets, and Enki, who is in charge of Earth and is the chief geneticist. And he's the one that seems to be kind of favorably disposed towards humanity. Enlil wants a group or a race of dumbed down workers that just does the mining operations that the Anunnaki need for their space fleets, whereas Enki is interested in the biological experiments of humans and wants to kind of like bring his experiment to some fruition. He sees a potential in there. So we see this rivalry. So what do you think that rivalry between Enki and Enlil, what's the significance of that in terms of what we find in the Bible?
That's a great question, because it will surprise many Christian believers to know that the Sumerian story of Enlil and Enki is in the Bible. We have a summary form of it in Genesis 3. Only the names of the characters have been changed. So the Enlil character, the space commander in charge of this region of space, he now has the name of Yahweh. And Enki, the one who's in charge of Project Earth, who's closer to the humans, who is really involved in the project to engineer Homo sapiens, his role is taken by the serpent. Now, any believer reading the Bible should pick up there's something funny going on in that text, that it can't really be taken at face value, because in the Bible's telling, Yahweh, the God character, is the bad guy. He's the one who wants to keep humans so unintelligent they don't even know they're naked. And it's the serpent who wants the human beings to have a better human experience, more conscious, more intelligent, fertile, and happy. How can that be? How can you have God the baddie, serpent the goodie? Something is not computing. As soon as you peel back the layers and get back to the sources and realize, oh, it's Enlil who wants us dumbed down. It's Enki who wants to upgrade us. We recognize the story and we realize what's going on. Yes, there's a conflict among the visitors as to how intelligent the human beings should be and whether we should go from having a workforce of male clones to having male and female so that they can have a happy animal experience, same as anybody else, and more intelligent and more conscious. Enki is the one who's here. He's hands-on in the project. He knows the humans, and he's come to realize that they're not happy living the way they've been engineered. They have to be allowed to be a fully fledged, fertile species, intelligent, self-conscious. Otherwise, he's realizing not only are they unhappy, they're not easy to manage. So he's the one arguing for the upgrade. And you see the conflicts there play out in various ways long after that particular episode. The stories to do with conflicts among the Sky Council tell us that they conflict continually over how intelligent the humans should be, how much access they should have to information, how much access they should have to healthy food, safe water, medical supplies, how many humans there should be on the planet's surface, how long they should live. These conflicts play out all through the pages of the Hebrew scriptures. And I would suggest that among the higher ups, those same discussions are had today.
Well, I mean, that's kind of pretty explosive for a lot of contemporary Christians, that the story, the Garden of Eden, that the serpent is depicted as the bad guy, and of course God, Yahweh, is depicted as the positive one. But of course, as you pointed out, that the story has this deeper layer of the serpent being the one that wants to empower humanity with wisdom, with knowledge. And that seems to me to be a kind of indication that the serpent really wanted to activate the Kundalini energy, or have humans empowered, where this kind of spiritual energy that's represented by the caduceus is flowing, and they then become fully empowered and able to kind of like deal with the superior knowledge and physical
Definitely.
abilities of the gods.
I'd want to add to that language as well, because I think we could express it in very nuts and bolts terms as well, which is to do with getting our brains to work. Because if you can go one of two places. Let's go to the Mayan version of the story, where we're told that Homo sapiens have been developed to a point where more of their brains are working, more of our ancestors' brains were working than at present. We're told there was a time when we were smarter than this. There was a time when our vision wasn't limited, and then they had to find a way of limiting our vision. And they did that by spraying a vapor over human populations, which would brain damage us. So if we look into that language and into that metaphor, what does it mean that our ancestors had vision that wasn't limited? Well, our vision is limited by surfaces. We can't see behind things. We can't see into things. Our vision is limited by distance. We can't see beyond the horizon into deep space. It's limited by time. We can only see the present. We can't see the future. We can't see the past. It's limited by frequency. We can only see this spectrum. A dog can see this spectrum. A cat can see this spectrum. And so if you take those limits off, all of a sudden you're talking about human beings who can future view, who can remote view, who have X-ray vision with all the advantage for self-healing that would bring. They have a better telepathic connection. And so it's to do with human beings who are fired up in every way, whether we're using the language of Kundalini and spiritual awakeness and alertness to other dimensions, or we're thinking in these very concrete terms of other bits of our brain working. And in Escaping from Eden, I talk about the field of study called acquired savant syndrome, which is a real field of study that is probed by credentialed neuroscientists around the world. And it's the phenomenon where people can suffer a brain injury or a central nervous system event, and all of a sudden they have a higher cognitive ability they didn't have before. They can speak a language they couldn't speak before. They've got phenomenal skills in mathematics or higher physics. They can play a musical instrument they couldn't play before. When this happens, this absolutely baffles us, because it runs totally against our conventional evolutionary understanding of what a human being is. And these scientists are asking the question, what sense does it make that we all have these higher cognitive abilities latent in our brains, but in the off position? What does it mean that they can be knocked on by accident? Our conventional understanding of ourselves can't explain it, but the ancient stories all explain it by saying, yes, we all have these higher cognitive abilities, but we have been dumbed down so that we can be managed. And all the cultures that have curated those stories have also curated protocols, approaches to releasing higher cognitive abilities, getting the limits off our vision, once again, to use that language.
Now, there's a story involving the first king, King Adapa, in the Sumerian text, which describes him as someone that was offered this elixir of life as a gift for something that he did, but that he was warned against it by Enki. So it seemed that Enki wanted to share the fruits of the tree of knowledge, awakening those higher potentials. But yet when it came to immortality, there was some reservation about that. And so, yeah, what do you make of the story of Adapa and this offer of the drink or the elixir of immortality? And there's the cuneiform text that shows King Adapa being offered the drink of immortality by Anu.
So when we read the biblical stories and the Sumerian stories and other stories around the world, there's this theme of human beings essentially wanting to get back what they had before. So not just the higher cognitive powers, but the longer lives. Because if those who are governing you live much longer than you do, there's a power imbalance there already. If they're able to self-heal, but they can injure and kill you, you're at a terrible disadvantage. So there are many reasons why human beings would want to get back to what their ancestors had in terms of very long lives or what would appear to be immortality. And so this theme of, do we give this human being the elixir? Do we give that human being the elixir? Occurs a couple of times in Sumerian story. So it's here in the story of Adapa, the purification priest of Eridu. It's there in the narrative of the Epic of Gilgamesh as well. It's there in the biblical story where the decision is made, no, the human beings will not have access to the tree of life, which is the language the Bible uses for it. So it crops up many times. And I think it's to do with a very deliberate imbalance. I think the idea is that if human beings don't live very long, then they don't have very long to work out what's really going on. You know, many people, when they reach about 80, think, wow, if I could live my life again with all the knowledge I have now and with all the confidence I have now, wouldn't that be awesome? But of course, it doesn't work that way. By the time you're really working out how to live and the secrets of life and why the world works the way it does, you're just about ready to cark it. And that is the plan. That is the design. And so that's why this theme crops up around the world of human beings longing to live as long as the gods, as the superiors, as the sky people, because that begins to empower us for a better human experience where we're less prone to being manipulated and exploited by longer lived others.
Well, one of the key stories in the Bible is, of course, Noah's Ark. And everything you've said, if we accept that as being correct, that means that the pre-flood civilization that that Noah lived in, and of course his ancestors, Enoch and Methuselah, that was a civilization where space technology was used by the Anunnaki. And so it stands to reason that the Great Flood itself was not just a kind of like an accident, that Enlil is regarded as bringing it about. So, you know, that suggests that he used his space fleet to create the flood, you know, using maybe directed energy weapons for weather modification purposes, melting ice caps, whatever it was that he did. He used his space fleet, and yet Enki helped Noah, or Utnapishtim in the Sumerian Akkadian version, build this ark. But would that ark that Enki helped Noah, Utnapishtim to build, be in this kind of wooden craft, or would it have been a spacecraft?
Oh, that's a great question. It's an absolutely fascinating story, the flood narrative, for many reasons. One reason is that there is a version of that story all around the world. It's not just a Jewish and a Christian story. Cultures all around the world have a memory of this massive inundation and a rescue of one family, and often one family and a bunch of animals. Now, our minds boggle the moment we are asked to take that story seriously rather than as a fable, because weather manipulation. And yet, the very first verses of Genesis begin with weather manipulation by visitors who arrive. The Bible calls them Elohim, the powerful ones. They arrive in a ruach, which is something that creates vortices of wind. In the Sumerian story, we're told it's the vortices of wind that separate the waters, salt water from fresh water, that begin to separate land from ocean, so that the planet can be rehabilitated for life on Earth. It's actually a recovery story in Genesis, where the planet is being rehabilitated. So we begin with modification of weather. We begin with the aftermath of a flood event. And I argue in the Eden series that by the time you reach Genesis 11, you've probably read references to 3 flood events. There are 2 flood stories sewn into one in Genesis 6. There's a post-flood narrative in Genesis 1. And then there are huge geological changes referenced in Genesis 10 and the extinction of a culture in Genesis 11. So this looks like a bit of a repeating story. In the Bible, once again, the current version raises a few eyebrows. I mean, it only takes a child to say, wait a minute, why is God genociding? Isn't genocide the worst crime against humanity? But we're saying it's all right when God does it. A child will raise that issue. Why would God change his mind? Why would God want to kill all the human beings that he's made? Isn't he a God of love? Again, it makes more sense when we read the source narratives and realize, oh, the God character in the Bible is the Enlil character in the original version. Enlil doesn't have this warm, fuzzy relationship with human beings. He thinks there are too many of them. The Sky Council have decided to cull them. And it's Enki, once again, who's on the side of the humans, who identifies a family and says, I'm going to ensure we can reseed this planet. So you get your extended family together. So that's 5 families, essentially. That's Noah's family and his sons' wives, and a bunch of animals is the way the story goes, because we're going to reseed. And how literally we take that? Well, that's a good question. Was it actually a space capsule? Was it actually a DNA farm? It would make sense to us with our modern minds to think in that way. But a curious thing is that the Artrahasis, Yusudra, Utnapishtim, Noah stories correlate in very close detail. And Irving Finkel went to great lengths to show that you could follow the instructions for building the ark, which turns out to be a coracle, according to the instructions given in the ancient texts, and you've got a viable vehicle that will float on flood waters, that has the same volume that's referenced in the Bible and all those Mesopotamian stories. So I don't know what to make of that. It's interesting that the details of the story are so persistent. But yes, looking with our modern minds, if we were to reseed a planet, we would be thinking in terms of get them off the planet's surface, let's have a DNA bank, let's know how to reactivate all those life forms. And there's a hint that if the humans didn't do it, other presences on planet Earth were doing exactly that, because we're told in the King's List of the Sumerian tradition and in the Bible of other presences who were here before the flood, left for the cataclysm and then returned after. And so that's the story of the Nephilim in Genesis 6. And again, raises the question, well, how did they get off the planet for the flood and how did they come back? We get into the detail of that. And again, we're reading about ancient technology.
Yes, I think that's a very important question, and it might be something that actually relates to what's happening in contemporary terms, because there have been a few sources that describe these space arcs as being very ancient and being a kind of rescue vehicle for humanity when it undergoes some kind of cataclysm, and that these are
Yes.
buried all over the earth. And because the flood story is universal to many earth cultures, so there's not just one Noah's Ark, there may be
No.
several of them.
No, that's right. And we do have references in the book of Ezekiel, in the Hebrew scriptures, and the book of Revelation in the New Testament, where the writers have either physically seen or they've remote viewed a craft that is designed to carry thousands and thousands of human beings. And in their own language, they describe artificial light. They describe the textures of a craft. They describe the lights of technology. They describe the what would we call hydroponic farms inside the craft itself. So in Revelation, it's described as a city, except we're told it's a cube that can carry tens of thousands of human beings. And in Ezekiel, it's described as a temple, a giant building, rather like the way the Vedas talk about flying buildings. But it's simply the ancients' frame of reference for describing huge craft that are designed for a breakaway civilization or to carry people like us here. Either way, we've got the story of locomotion to and from planet Earth. And yes, if we've got materials retrieved from small craft, it's entirely possible that we have far larger craft that have landed here and remained here. And there are some very large, should we say, pixelated areas of planet Earth where that is entirely possible.
Fascinating. So one of the things that you describe in the Eden Conspiracy is these ancient battles between humans, and you say that those make much more sense in terms of competing extraterrestrial factions, which we've described already, Enki and Enlil being different factional leaders and each having their own followers and cliques, that these battles are much more accurately described as emanating from these competing extraterrestrial groups, as opposed to one all-powerful deity, Yahweh, as described in the Hebrew and Christian Bible. So you want to just explain why that makes more sense?
Well, it's actually spelled out for us in the Hebrew scriptures, but in a way that doesn't often get preached on because it doesn't fit with our mainstream monotheism. But there is a moment when we are told that the Elohim, the powerful ones, are meeting in council. They're presided over by a being referenced as El Elyon. So that's the powerful one, more senior than the other powerful ones. That's what that name means. And then Yahweh is one of the junior Elohim, one of the junior powerful ones. And in this story, and it's referenced a couple of times, El Elyon is parceling out portions of planet Earth to different powerful ones, so that there will be a landmass and then a powerful one governing over the humans on that land and exploiting all the resources of that land. And Yahweh gets a people group with no land. So he's in a foul mood from that point on, and he has to go to war with other powerful ones to get bits of their land and to get their resources. Once you've read that moment, you understand why there's so much competition and warfare in the Yahweh stories, why he has this jealous, acquisitive relationship with other powerful ones, why he hates the powerful one of Ekron, and he uses the same name to describe him as himself, why Joshua tells the people, don't serve the other powerful ones, serve our powerful one. Don't serve Achech of Egypt, serve Yahweh, our powerful one. And it's all about maintaining control. And when Yahweh feels that his power over territory or people is slipping, that's when he really escalates the violence. And you see this in the book of Ezekiel. He's absolutely horrified that his people group are acknowledging the other powerful ones and have carvings of them in the temple. And he decides he's going to ethnically cleanse his district so that any of his people who have any interest in the other powerful ones will be killed. And he sends out 6 individuals equipped with a Keli Mashatau or a Keli Mapasau. One is a destroying thing, the other is a disintegrating thing. And apparently 6 individuals equipped with those can ethnically cleanse an entire district. And it sounds mind-boggling. How can you identify people who are not grieving over the carvings in the temple? We have cultures today where if your family doesn't go to a public event and show open grief when your leader is sick or has passed away, you're in big trouble and you might be executed. Exactly the same thing is going on in the book of Ezekiel, and it has to do with Yahweh trying to keep control of his land, trying to keep control of his people when he is in competition with all the Elohim who have had better allotments than he was given. And until you get that big picture, which is spelled out in the Hebrew scriptures, I'm not making this up, you can go and read it for yourselves. Once you see it that way, it frames everything else that happens. And you realize a world is being described where humans are being caught up in proxy wars, wars that are among the powers, but where the people really have no argument with one another. It's the powers competing for resources and hegemony, and the human beings get caught in the crossfire.
Well, I know the ancient Greeks, especially Homer, he described that to a T. I mean, he described the Iliad as this kind of war that was totally engineered by the gods over kind of trivial things like a beauty contest of all things. But, you know, for the gods, the assembly of gods, this was something that, you know, they had no problem having their different factions go to war against each other. And so it seems like the Greeks had it right, and that
Yes.
they had insight, or maybe their memory, or maybe they more openly interacted with these gods. Why do you think Homer and the Greeks had it right, and kind of like our contemporary or the Hebrew faith got it wrong?
Well, I think the answer to that is that in the 8th to 6th century BCE, there was a change of the narrative in Judaism. There was a sequence of kings and high priests who wanted to turn Judaism into monotheism. Effectively, what they wanted was an easily governed theocracy with one God, one king, one high priest, one temple. And so they wanted to extinguish the memory of all these other advanced beings. They would keep Yahweh and say that's the real God, and then Asherah, Dagon, Baal, get rid of those, demolish all the installations to them, disband the priesthoods, knock down the standing stones where our ancestors met these beings. So there's now only one story, one authority, one religion, and we forget all that paleo-contact stuff. King Hezekiah begins the process. King Josiah continues it. It begins with a ritual reform, and then an edit of the scriptures, and then Ezra runs that new religion moving forward. So the change is described. It's a change that centralizes the power to control the narrative, that centralizes the economy. Now all the tithes and taxes are coming to Jerusalem. There's only one narrative, that being told us by the one high priest. So we who are on the other side of that shift, whether in the Jewish tradition or the Christian tradition, now see the whole world through that lens. So for us, paleo-contact has been a taboo. The idea of a populated cosmos has been a taboo. The idea that we had visitors in the past who helped us learn agronomy and make the great leap forward, a taboo. That wasn't the case in the Greek culture, which was a melting pot of the world's wisdom. Plato, the Greek philosopher, was a brilliant synthesizer of the accrued wisdom of the world. He synthesized a coherent worldview, which he then argued for on the basis of logic. And it was a view that embraced paleo-contact, that embraced the idea of populated universe, that embraced the idea of reactivating higher cognitive powers. And so the Greeks were unafraid with all these big concepts because they weren't trying to turn everything into a theocracy. They weren't trying to manage everything in the way those Hebrew kings were. And so those ideas survived and were re-explained and re-argued for by Plato. They were very much part of Greek thinking. And many of the early church fathers, that was how they thought. And they saw no conflict between that thinking and getting on board with what Jesus was on about. And so you go to other cultures and you go further east, again, they have run with the ancient stories. The Vedas are still there with all their stories of the wars in the heavens and ancient technology. And as to the Greek story, I remember going to Knossos as a boy and seeing the remnants of this very advanced civilization that lived there. And I asked the guide, how come the Minoan culture that produced all this, that had such fabulous cities, that had sanitation, that had air conditioning systems, how did they get so clever? And his explanation was, well, the Minoan culture that lived here was the product of King Minos. And Minos wasn't human, he was a hybrid. He had some human DNA, but he had the DNA of higher beings as well. And this was a hybridization that occurred because a being called Zeus abducted a human female called Europa, and they produced 3 hybrid children. Now, he told me this as history, as an explanation of what was there on the island of Knossos, where he said this Zeus character was buried because he died in a battle. Now, that's slightly different from the mainstream Greek telling of the story, but it's the long-standing Cretan telling of the story. And it amazed me that what I had been taught in school as fable was being taught as history. They were that much closer and much less afraid of the ancient stories. And for the first time, I realized that the whole of Europe is named after what we would call an ET abductee, is a recollection of an ancient pattern of hybridization. Today in the West, post that change, post-Judaism, post-Christianity, if we hear about ET abductions, hybridization, we think, oh, National Enquirer, $50, that's the explanation for that story. If you grow up in Greece, you're not going to take that view because that's the story that has been known and told and relayed for generations and for thousands of years.
Well, one of the key figures in this transition from this kind of polytheistic worldview that the ancient Hebrews had to this monotheistic worldview is Asherah. And you mention her, you discuss her as being someone that was worshipped by the ancient Israelites before this transition period, and that the worshippers of Asherah kind of like disparaged Yahweh. They kind of saw him as some sort of lesser being. So who was she? And you know, are we talking about a kind of like a male female divine relationship, like was like Zeus had a consort Hera? So was this the relationship between Yahweh and Asherah?
Yes, some people have wondered that because they're often referred to side by side, and there have been a couple of archaeological finds where Asherah and Yahweh are named side by side. I argue in the Eden Conspiracy that they are the 2 poles of the paleo-contact experience, because the book of Jeremiah in the Hebrew scriptures and the book of 2 Kings tells us exactly what you just said, Michael, that before the great change, the great reform of the 8th century BCE, the tribes of Israel remembered Yahweh negatively. That was an experience of colonization. That was an experience of exploitation, and they didn't follow his laws anymore. 1 Samuel 15 tells us the moment where the people came together and said, we are not serving you anymore. We're going to have human governance for human society. Thank you very much. And they attempt to get rid of Yahweh, although unfortunately he then turns into a covert government and pulls strings from behind closed doors. All that is remembered prior to the 8th century BCE, so they remember him negatively. Jeremiah in 2 Kings says they disparaged him. They spoke slightingly of him. They rejected his laws. Meanwhile, on every high hill, under every green tree, from every fortified town to every garrison city, in every place they lived, Asherah was commemorated positively. And archaeology has confirmed that throughout Judea, throughout the Levant, find installations commemorating Asherah. Handheld figurines of Asherah were the most prolific devotional object you could expect to find in an ancient Jewish home. And Asherah was emphatically female. In the carvings of her, in the handheld figurines, what's emphasized is the vulva, bare breasts, big bouffant hair, and she was honored at harvest festivals. She's been commemorated for her tutelage in the distant past in agronomy. She is the one who taught our ancestors how to farm, which plants are good for food, which are good to avoid, which are good for medicines, which are good for higher cognitive powers. Once you have farming, you have surpluses. Once you have surpluses, you can specialize. You can live in greater densities. You can have cities. You can become a civilization. So Asherah is the figure identified with the Great Leap Forward. So she's the Jewish version of the Mayan Hunahpu or the Zulu, Mbabwana, Warisa. All around the world, these generally female figures are honored for this ancient tutelage in agronomy. So it's part of a global story. And in the Eden Conspiracy, I take that a step further and ask, where did she come from? And I talk about a find in a place called Tel El Farah. A device called a naus was found, a carving of a naus. And a naus is a doorway that has no building around it, and there's nothing behind it. It's just a doorway to nothing, and yet through that doorway, advanced beings like Asherah can step. And I argue that we have language for that today. We would call it a portal. And above that portal is the carving of a crescent moon and a batch of stars. In the symbology of ancient Sumeria, that crescent moon references the Taurus constellation. That batch of stars sits on the shoulder of Taurus. It's the stars of the Pleiades. And so this little find, no more than 30 centimeters tall, is telling us here, by these standing stones, our ancestors met someone. It was Asherah, represented by two inverted palm trees. How did she get here? Through a portal. Where did she come from? From the Pleiades. And you might say, oh, well, that's just one interpretation of those things. Yes, it is, but it lines up entirely with the claims of other ancient cultures. Listen to Native American story. Listen to the story from out of Hawaii. Listen to the story from Aboriginal Australians. And there is the Pleiades, mentioned time after time as the place from which our ancient tutors came to enable our great leap forward. That is there in the Bible as well. Jeremiah and 2 Kings recall the time when that was a central part of Jewish belief and practice. And then they tell us how all that was suppressed, obliterated, knocked down, demolished, disbanded, so that now we're having to piece the picture back together again. And in the Eden Conspiracy, I take the reader back into the Bible and show them the pieces of the puzzle and how they fit together. That we are told about paleocontact. We are told that that was Jewish memory in the same way that it was Greek memory, Norse memory, African memory. It's a global story, and it's there in the Bible too.
So with Asherah, so what you're saying is then that there's good reason to believe that she was in fact from the Pleiades. She was a Pleiadian, and with Yahweh being one of these minor Anunnaki. So in a sense, you know, if they weren't consorts, they could have been rivals, different factions of extraterrestrials. That it wasn't just one group of extraterrestrials, the Anunnaki here, conducting their genetic experiment, but the Pleiadians were also running their own.
That's quite right. So not just one group. In fact, the Bible in the book of Job references 3 regions of space from which visitors came: Orion, Sirius, and the Pleiades. It talks about this body, the El Ba'adat, the Council of Powers, or what we might call the Sky Council. And then it references these conflicting agendas: an agenda for exploitation, an agenda for mining, and then an agenda for nurture and assistance. So it says from the beginning, there have been multiple demographics interested in Project Earth, and they have conflicted with each other as to how the project should be managed. And I believe they tell us that not only so that we would know how things were in the past, but so that we would understand why things are the way they are today. Our ancestors believed we would never have a full understanding of what's happening on Earth until we recognize there is a non-human layer to the story of our planet and our species.
Well, I know you've done quite a bit of work with Mauro Bellino, who has written a book, The Naked Bible, where he also comes up with this justification or this kind of understanding that there was this transition from the ancient polytheism in the Hebrew faith to the contemporary monotheism. So, I mean, how important is he to your work and to helping people better understand what's really going on in the Bible?
When I first came to this understanding through my research path for Escaping from Eden, I'd never heard of Mauro Bellino, but I was delighted as I came towards the end of producing that book to learn that I wasn't the only person arguing for these translations from the biblical texts. There was this Italian scholar as well, an Italian Bible scholar, and not just any old Italian Bible scholar. Mauro's work was with the Edizione Salla Paul, producing the interlinear translations for Vatican-approved Bibles. Now, that's a very exacting discipline, because giving the interlinear meaning means you have to give the root meaning of each word without imposing interpretations into it. And so he was becoming very clear that the story told by the interlinear translation was different to the traditional translations side by side on the page. He began to realize what I realized. It's a story of paleo contact. He worked for the Edizione Salla Paul for a long time, and he argued that some of these words should be left untranslated so that the reader could see for themselves how the Yahweh character behaves, what role El Elyon takes. He would love to have taken it further. How does a kavod behave? How does a ruach behave? How does a keli mapasau function? If you leave the words untranslated, it becomes blindingly obvious you've got a story of paleo contact and ancient technology. So I was thrilled to discover him. And at one point I thought, oh, should I stop and read everything Mauro's written before I finish my book? And I thought, no, I won't do that, because it's far more interesting for the reader if I apply my logic to my data using my skills from my background and reach similar conclusions to other scholars like Mauro. Then it's more interesting for the reader, because when they see the overlap, they'll think, oh my goodness, there really is something here. But in the Eden Conspiracy, we actually get together. We've produced a documentary series together, which you can watch on the Fifth Kind TV, where we drill down into some of the words the Bible has associated with God, and we argue that the root meanings show us something completely different. And in the Eden Conspiracy, I make reference to this series. I go to these words, I show how they operate, and again, make the point of, if you're not convinced by my root meanings translations, leave them untranslated and let the drama of the texts themselves tell you what is going on. And that was a lesson I learned from Mauro.
One of the big discoveries in the 20th century was the Nag Hammadi texts, where it was clear that there was a group of Christians called Gnostics who saw Yahweh as a demiurge, as a pretender, and that Jesus or Yeshua actually prayed to a very different God, El Elyon, I guess that would be the appropriate term. So you're essentially agreeing that the Gnostics got it right, that Yahweh was a pretender, and that Jesus prayed not to Yahweh, but prayed to another supreme God called El Elyon, or whatever other term.
Well, when we read the texts that came out of the Nag Hammadi find, we are reminded that in the beginning, Christianity was a great kaleidoscope of texts and experiences and theologies and ideas, and that it was a far more interesting picture that emerged from them. Just as there was a paring down of Judaism into a simple, clean monotheism, the same thing happened with Christianity. In the beginning, there were all these ideas, experiences, and documents, and then after 3 and a bit centuries, it had been pared down to an official canon. And so everything that falls outside the canon tends to get called Gnostic these days. And it's not that they all say exactly the same thing, they are just the other, the non-canonical texts. But even if you go to the canonical texts, it's rather telling. Jesus never mentions Yahweh by name. He doesn't teach in his name. And in a number of moments, he actually seems quite opposed to Yahwistic law. And early on in the church's story, in the book of Acts, the apostolic leaders realize Christianity is not built on Yahwistic law. Jesus has cancelled it. Many times he said, you've heard it said, but I say this. Moses said this, but I say this. The law said this, but I say this. He's putting Yahwistic law to one side and bringing something quite new. He talks to the Jewish leaders and he says, your father was a liar. Your father was a murderer. Your father was a devil. Well, who's he talking about? And why does he never pray to Yahweh? In the canonical Gospels, Jesus, when he prays, he uses the word Abba, which means father. When the Gospel writers write, they use the Greek words kurios for Lord and theos. And theos means the God and source of the cosmos. The Apostle Paul defines the idea in Acts 17 when he says, by God I mean the source of the cosmos and everything in it, that in which we all live and move and have our being, of whom we are all offspring. And that's very different from the vision of Yahweh in the Hebrew scriptures, in which Yahweh is an entity in competition with other entities, at war with other entities. And so there's quite a break from one tradition to the other. Jesus was emphatically not a Yahwist. And even on the one occasion when he's in a synagogue reading from a Yahwist text, the gospel writers cannot bring themselves even to write the name Yahweh. They say kurios, pneuma kurios, the spirit of kurios, the spirit of the Lord. And so, yes, there's a break. You go into the non-canonical gospels and yes, a more interesting picture emerges. And you've got international thought washing through those texts, the idea that we are conscious beings who then have a material experience and then go on to another experience, that is in those gospels. The idea that our region of space was modified by beings that were not God, that our planet was terraformed by a being who was not God, it's in those texts that you'll find it. And it wasn't just the Gospels that were found at the Nag Hammadi. Copies of the Book of Enoch were found there as well, which had not become part of the mainstream Hebrew canon because it's so overt in its description of contact with non-human entities. So in the Eden Conspiracy, again, I say, go back and look at what Christianity was in the beginning. Listen to what church fathers like Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Marcion were saying, and you'll realize that what I'm saying is really primitive Christianity, Christianity that wasn't afraid to acknowledge a populated universe and that wasn't afraid to acknowledge paleo contact in the Bible.
Well, I think there'd be a lot of political scientists who might be atheists, agnostics, and think, okay, well, so what? You know, I mean, this is all these stories about the Bible and the Sumerians. That's ancient history. It has no relevance to us. Well, I would make the case that when you have people like Professor Haim Eshed, and you actually spend a chapter discussing his claims, his revelation that there is a galactic federation currently visiting Earth and was working with the Trump administration. That sounds awfully a lot like the Sky Council that the Sumerians talked about, that you referred to in terms of your discussion of the Hebrew text. So in a way, would you agree that those that take the position that, well, religion has nothing to do with politics and contemporary science, it's like, no, you're wrong. Actually, religion and the Sumerian texts give us an idea of these extraterrestrial entities and organizations that not only existed back tens of thousands of years ago, but are playing an important role today.
Yes. Well, I totally understand people being nervous of religion, which is why I love the Sumerian texts so much. The Sumerian, Babylonian, Akkadian, Assyrian texts, they are not sacred texts in any religion. So go there, read those, and work out what they're teaching. They talk about the Sky Council. They talk about contact that's been there for thousands of years. Anyone familiar with those texts would be unsurprised by what Hayam Ashed said just before Christmas 2020. And we should say he was the brigadier general who for 28 years was the chief of Israel's space security program. So it's his job to know if we were in contact. And he says, yes, we are. Yes, there's this galactic federation. You hear that, you think, oh, I know that because it's in the Sumerian texts. But I would also say, well, if you're nervous of religion, so am I. But the Bible isn't about religion for the most part. The Bible is about paleo contact. And once you read it through that lens, you realize it's teaching you about covert government and covert contact. Anyone who reads the ancient texts of the Hebrew scriptures, again, will be unsurprised that there is a galactic federation, because the Bible calls it the El Ba'adat, the Council of Powers. It's the Sky Council. It's the Tseva Hashemayim, the sky armies. And so whether you go to the Bible, African story, the Vedas, Norse story, our ancestors have always said there is a non-human layer to the governance of our planet. Back in the 1600s, Robert Kirk, a Presbyterian minister in Aberfoyle in Scotland, wrote a book which he had produced simply by listening to Celtic story, listening to the lived experience of the locals. And he joined the dots and he argued that if you want to understand why things work the way they do on planet Earth, you have to understand, first of all, there are elites that operate above national governments, and they are in contact with a non-human presence. That's exactly the same thing that Hayam Ashed said. That's what the Bible is about. It isn't about religion. It's not there to teach religion once you see the big picture. Once you read the story of that reform from King Hezekiah through to the senior priest Ezra, you realize, oh my goodness, the authors have guaranteed that we never forget paleo contact by telling us how that story was suppressed and changed. So it's an explanation of the world today, why things work the way they do, why there are still conflicts over how many human beings there should be on the planet, how long we should live, what access to medicine, what access to clean, safe drinking water, which is going to be a huge issue in the 21st century. Our ancestors wrote this to equip us for the present and to engage intelligently with geopolitics today. And this is why I love the term exopolitics, because I think we can't have an intelligent geopolitics until we realize exopolitics is involved. My hope for the future is not in the candidates who we're allowed to vote for from one general election to the next, but in terms of our allies on the Intergalactic Federation, our allies on the Council of Powers. If we didn't have allies in higher places, then we would have been exploited to the point of non-existence. And once we join the dots and realize there are some presences here because they're supporting the human experience, then I believe we're in a position to engage more intelligently with what's really going on. And I want to emphasize that because I think at the moment what's in the news is framing all contact as terrifying, negative, invasion of the body snatchers, Mars attacks, and that is not the whole picture. It's an aspect of it, without a doubt. We have faced exploitation, we've faced hostility, but that's just at one end of the spectrum. And we have helpers at the other, and we have a council of powers. And I'm interested in us as a species engaging more intelligently with that, knowing who our friends are, knowing who we should work with for the betterment of the human experience.
Well, currently in the United States, I mean, there are three unidentified aerial or unidentified anomalous phenomena investigations being conducted. One's being conducted by the Pentagon through the Arrow office. Another is being conducted by NASA. And a third is being conducted by an interagency organization being headed by the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. So what would you say to people in those investigations in terms of your research into this ancient extraterrestrial presence, that the UAPs that are being explored now or being investigated, you know, what are the chances that some or many of those are actually remnants or craft belonging to these ancient extraterrestrial civilizations that are still here, or maybe some of their technology is left behind?
Yes, I'm confident that some are. If you just follow Sumerian story and join the dots to the recent story of Iraq, I think you arrive at a yes. I think if you follow the white rabbit to Antarctica and wonder what's being protected there, I think you'll get to a yes in terms of ancient technology. And to those in the programs, I would say our ancestors trusted the people with the knowledge that we're in a populated cosmos. How can our ancestors have been better able to cope with that information than people today? Recent polling suggests that 70% of Americans would be totally unsurprised if they were told, actually, we're in contact. So there's not going to be the blind panic that we've assumed in the past there would be. All these bodies are communities of people. Just as the government is a community of people, the Pentagon is a community of people. And so there's always a spectrum of views within any group. There'll be some wanting more disclosure, some wanting less, some more confident of the public response, some less. So there's always this push and pull in the process of disclosure. So this is disclosed, then there's a pulling back. This is disclosed, then there's a pulling back. And it represents, I think, a bit of a to and a fro in the conversation. But I would say, look, with that polling of 70%, with our Greek cousins unafraid of these ancient stories, with indigenous cultures unafraid of these stories, they're not living in blind panic. And I think neither would the majority. I actually think the approach of soft disclosure that's been going on is wise. Drip, drip, drip the information until people are not shocked, people are unsurprised. But I would really want to urge the journalists to keep this in the news cycle, to keep the pressure up, to say we do want to know what's going on, and no, there's not going to be a blind panic. And I think if we continue down this path of gradual disclosure, the powers don't have to be afraid of the enormous political fallout that they're obviously fearing. They don't want a percussive moment where the American president steps forward and says, my fellow Americans, I've got something I want to tell you, and then say, we've been keeping secrets for 70 years. No, let it out gently, that's fine, but let it out. Because I think Homo sapiens are intelligent enough to cope with living in a populated universe, and I think knowledge is power. The more we know of what's going on, the better we are to engage with it intelligently.
Do you think there's enough awareness among Christian pastors and ministers about the extraterrestrial presence to educate Christians about what is coming? Because I know there's a lot of Christians, especially in the evangelical Christian community, who have these very generalized views of extraterrestrials as being demons. And there's a refreshing number that are like rejecting that and having a more nuanced perspective. But looking at this phenomenon, I'm a little concerned that maybe there's going to be a lot of Christian evangelicals that are going to be deeply shocked and won't be able to accept research such as yours, that some of these extraterrestrials are friends, they're potential allies in a very challenging and hostile universe. So what would you say to the Christian community?
Yes, I think many churchgoers would be very shocked. And one of the reasons I'm motivated to produce my books is to bring people of faith into the conversation. I get people every single day from the Christian world attacking me for what I'm writing. And from time to time, I'll say, go and ask your pastor if what I'm saying makes sense of what is in the texts. Because a lot of Christians would be shocked if they went to their pastor and say, do you believe that our God stories are based on Sumerian stories of ETs? Well, if they've got a degree in theology, they'll have to say, I was somewhat aware of that, yes. And even if their pastor doesn't, go to your seminary where your pastors come from and ask them if they are aware of the Sumerian narratives being about ETs and the Bible being based on that. Get to the seminary. It's something we don't talk about, but go to the higher ups in the denomination. Yes, this is what frustrates me. Since the 1800s, academic authorities have known about the ET narratives on which the Bible is based, but it hasn't filtered down into the preaching in churches. And so in a way, I'm challenging pastors and senior church authorities with the Eden conspiracy to say, come clean. Will you own up to what you learned in your degree? Will you own up to what was discovered in the 1800s when we translated the cuneiforms for the first time? And if you're a pastor who knows there are ETs in the Bible, let your people see it. If there's a text like Genesis 6, where it's blindingly obvious there are ETs washing about in it, don't gloss over it. Don't cover it up. If people have questions, encourage the questions. If there's an openness to the text and it can mean different things, let it be open. Trust the intelligence of your people, because you can bet your bottom dollar half your congregation have worked this out, but don't know there's permission to talk about it. 2009, the Roman Catholic Church, under the most conservative pope in my lifetime, gave permission to believers all around the world to go back to the Bible and find ETs in it. And they did that through the colloquium of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. They did it through sending senior spokespeople out, like Monsignor Corrado Balducci, the Vatican senior advisor in paranormal ministry, Father Jose Gabriel Funes, the director of the Vatican Observatory, Reverend Dr. Guy Consolmagno, senior astronomer for the Vatican Observatory. They are senior spokespeople for the Curia. They met the press, they did interviews, they did magazine interviews, they did TV interviews, where they said, yes, we should expect ET contact. No, we should not be surprised. We should be ready to embrace them as a brother or sister alien. We shouldn't be surprised because they're there in the Bible. Now look, if the Roman Catholic Church can do that under a pope as conservative as Pope Benedict XVI, it's high time that the rest of the churches give permission to their people to ask these questions, to see what's in the text, and then have an open conversation about it. I know that there are what you might call mega pastors in the States who know everything I have told you today, but haven't preached a single sermon on it yet, because they are frightened of their people's reaction. But again, I say you can go softly, softly. You can read a text and say, now, what in the world is going on there? And don't answer the question. Trust your people's intelligence to join the dots, to put the puzzle pieces together. And I think also, once again, if you're a pastor, your job is to pastor people through the reframing that results from seeing what's in front of them. Many people in your churches will have had close encounter experiences. If they can't talk to you about it, who are they going to talk to? And if you can't pastor them through that, well, you should be able to, because I agree with the RC position on this. It is in the Bible from start to finish, and we should be coming to terms with it. I actually believe Christians around the world are far more ready to deal with this than we give them credit for. Very often when I'm attacked by people saying, oh no, aliens are all demons, or this is fallen angels, or this, you shouldn't be talking about this is ungodly, 90% of the time, when I engage and I reply and I say, thank you for your comment, the reason I say this is this, and I just show the data, and I show the logic, 90% of the time, the person will say, oh, I see what you mean. And that leads me to a far more optimistic view that believers of every hue and color around the world can do business with what is going on, can engage with what's in the news right now, can engage with ancestral memory of contact, and begin to open up to a far more interesting cosmos.